Now that I have finished our look at the period of the early empire, when the foundations of imperial rule were established, and we saw the propagandistic uses of imperial portraiture and some groundbreaking new uses of architecture, along with how civic venues such as the Flavian Amphitheater were used to define the social status of the citizen of Roman society, it's time to take a quick look at the High Empire. This is the period considered by historians to be the golden age of Rome. It spans the career of what are called the five good emperors, sometimes called the adoptive emperors. These were arguably some of the best emperors in the history of the Roman Empire, which was made possible by each emperor, except the last one unfortunately, eschewing the practice that had been established by Caesar Augustus of passing rule along to their son, or nearest male relative, which often resulted in the rulers of the most powerful nation in the Western world being individuals of decidedly low character who had succumbed to the corruption of absolute power. They were often venal, vicious, self-centered, megalomaniacal, cruel, despotic, immoral, and in some cases just downright deranged. Instead, emperors during the High Empire will be deliberately chosen for their abilities and their strength of character that had been proven through years of service to the state, and then were adopted as sons to succeed the current emperor. Thus we see a 90-year span of time in which 5 emperors will rule with competence and ability. These emperors were Nerva, Trajan, Hadrian, Antoninus Pius, and Marcus Aurelius. Of these, Nerva accomplished the least and ruled the shortest length of time, just 15 months, but established the tradition of choosing as successor the most capable man available. He himself had been chosen by the Senate following the death of the deranged Domitian. He was at that time an elderly man, but had proven himself to be a competent administrator during the reigns of Nero, Vespasian, Titus, and Domitian. So let's take a look at the art and architecture that was generated during this remarkable span of years. The emperor chosen by Nerva was a man by the name of Trajan, who ruled from 98 to 117 AD. He was born in Spain, interestingly enough, thus being the first non-Italian emperor. The empire reached its greatest extent with his conquests. Basically, this area that we know as Romania today, which was then called Dacia, so in Central Europe. So he was a military man, but he was also adept politically and certainly gave great respect to the members of the Senate and thereby earned from them for his achievements and his respect the title of Optimus, which means the best. Now later, emperors were invested with power by the Senate with the admonition Felicior Augusto Melior Traiano, which means be luckier than Augustus and better than Trajan, which gives us an idea of in what high regard they held Trajan. Now, Trajan's major architectural achievement was the creation of his Forum, the Forum of Trajan in 112 AD. So here we're looking at a view of the central portion of Rome, of this great model that was created to show us what Rome would have looked like about the height of its empire. And before we look at the Forum, let's just identify a few of the sites that we have already talked about, just so you can, to orient you relative to the Forum itself. So first of all, there is the Forum Romanum, in the center, basically, of Rome, in that valley that stretches from the Capitoline down southward toward the Colosseum. This is where the main business district, basically, of Rome was located. Then we have the small Forum of Julius Caesar. It became one of the first forums to be built right at the head of the Forum Romanum. Then we have Augustus's Forum, located right there. Next, the Capitoline Hill, at the head of the valley where the Forum Romanum was located, and the location of the Temple of Jupiter Optimus Maximus, the best and the biggest. Then next, the Palatine Hill itself with the palaces of the emperors, located right next to the Circus Maximus, as we saw in our last discussion. And we see here an aqueduct that was built by Nero to bring water to the Palatine Hill. And then the Flavian Amphitheater, as we discussed in our last lecture. And right close to it, the Forum of Vespasian. And next to that, we have a tiny little space here, the Arch of Titus that we looked at last time as well. And then finally, the Forum of Trajan. So in the north end of this collection of forums of the civic center, basically, of ancient Rome, we have the Forum of Trajan. So let's take a look at the Forum. First of all, the architect was a fellow from the Middle East, Damascus, Apollodorus of Damascus. The forum that he creates will be the largest forum in Rome. It was the very first forum to feature a basilica instead of a temple. And so when you look at the forum here, you can see the large plaza out in front, this peristyle court out in front. Then behind it on the north end is a large building, a civic building, and we'll look at that in detail in just a moment. And then behind that, a temple that will be built in honor of the deified Trajan by his successor Hadrian. So there is a temple to Trajan behind it. So this is the Forum of Trajan is the first one to have a basilica instead of a temple at the one end of the courtyard. So here is a view of Rome as seen today from Google Earth. And so let's fly down and just locate where the Forum of Trajan is. So from this view, of course, you can see familiar sites. So the Circus Maximus here, the Palatine Hill there, the Capitoline Hill right here, and there you can barely see the monument to Victor Emmanuel, and then of course the Flavian Amphitheater here. And then this is the main square of Rome today. It's called the Piazza Venezia, and right on the edge of it is the Palace of Mussolini, the World War II dictator, fascist dictator of Italy. And he had constructed a roadway between his palace and the Flavian Amphitheater, the Colosseum here, in order to make a symbolic link between himself and the ancient Roman Empire. This roadway was built, as you can kind of guess here, was built over the tops of several forums. A certain amount of excavation is going on there today in order to try to excavate those forums on either side of the imperial way, as it's called, and even underneath it in order to reveal to us what those forums were like in ancient Rome. So let's go ahead and fly down and see it. So there we see the central forum, the Forum Romanum, and then right next to the monument to Victor Emmanuel, we see a set of columns. So the basilica for the Forum of Trajan would have stood approximately right there where those columns are. So let's go down and take a look at the building in a little bit more detail. But before we look at the basilica itself, let's take a look at the most remarkable feature of this whole complex. And that is this monumental column that stands behind the basilica. So here's the basilica, the courtyard, forum courtyard is out on the south, the basilica, then this monumental column of Trajan, and then on either side the libraries, one containing volumes of Greek literature, the other one volumes of Latin literature. So here's a so-called Column of Trajan, raised in 112 AD. You can see it consists of a very large pedestal that was eventually became the mausoleum for Trajan and his wife, and then this monumental column that is surmounted by a viewing platform, and then a statue. It originally would have been a statue to Trajan here. Now it has been replaced in the modern times with a bronze statue of St. Peter. So like the forum, the column itself was designed by Apollodorus. It is the first of its kind, but has been often copied. So, for example, you see this column here in Paris, the Vendôme column. It's bronze and was raised by Napoleon in order to commemorate one of his great victories. So the Column of Trajan is 125 feet tall with a statue of Trajan on top and a tomb in the base. The column is composed of 20 60-ton drums of marble. And something that most tourists are not aware of is that there is a spiral staircase actually carved out of the center of those drums. So here's my simple model of this column showing you one of these drums. So there's a drum, and you can see that this is originally a solid cylinder of marble. And from it is carved a central post along with the steps for the spiral staircase. You can see the holes at the top, and there would have been corresponding holes on the bottom, and those would have held bronze or iron pins that would help connect the drums together, very similar to what we saw with columns in ancient Greece. So arguably the most remarkable feature of the Column of Trajan is a 625-foot-long spiral relief that goes from the base of the column all the way up to the viewing platform. And this contains something around 2,500 figures commemorating the Dacian Wars, that military campaign in which Trajan brings in that northeastern chunk of territory that is today's Romania and adds it to the empire. So I did this little model to give you some idea of the scale of the column as well as the way that it would have looked originally. So here I've placed my little geometric guy in here to give you an idea of the scale. We'll pull back and see the whole column, and then we'll cut it open and take a look at that spiral staircase inside along with the painted sculptures that would have been on the exterior. So let's run this little animation. And then this is the way it would have looked, fully painted, all the way from the base clear to the viewing platform. And then cutaway view of the spiral staircase, and then seeing inside these caskets, basically these little tabernacles that would have held the ashes of Trajan and his wife. So basically the base was a mausoleum, and then a viewing platform surmounts the column. So here is an illustration I got from National Geographic that nicely illustrates these elements and shows us the way the figures would have been painted. So the way that this would have been constructed is by creating the marble drums first, stacking them on top of each other, then carving the relief figures, and then painting them. And of course, as I say, originally a bronze statue of Trajan would have stood on top, and then you see the viewing platform here. Tourists can no longer climb to the top here, but nevertheless would have been accessible originally. And then, of course, the whole thing surmounted by a monumental statue of Trajan. So art historically, the thing that's important about the Column of Trajan, it marks a turning point in official Roman sculpture, because what it does is to introduce abstractions into official royal art, sacrificing the realism that had been so typical of early Roman sculptures, like we saw up to this point, sacrificing that for abstraction, for the sake of narrative, for the sake of being able to tell the story clearly. So let's take a look at what this means. So here we see a closer view of a portion of the spiral sculpture featuring all these hundreds of figures. And I show you this to remind you that this was out in the bright Italian sunlight. And so one of the considerations that the sculptors had to keep in mind is how do we make this story as legible as possible? Show you the base of it here, and we can see that we've got multitudes of figures working on things. These are soldiers on campaign. Here's a closer section of the relief to give you an idea of what I mean by the abstractions. So what we have here is a group of soldiers that are working on something. They're building a city wall, obviously. And so what we see here is, by contrast to a traditional relief, you get very realistic kind of representations here, less so on the relief on the Column of Trajan. So deep relief here and shallow relief here, a more abstract representation. So one of the things that we see first then is a flattened relief. Now by contrast to this portrayal over here, we've got figures carved very realistically and distributed in depth, as well as having a great deal of volume and mass for themselves in a realistic sort of portrayal. Also, another thing that we see as an abstraction in the relief of the Column of Trajan is ambiguous space. Now what I mean by ambiguous space is when we look at this traditional relief here, this deep relief or high relief, we get a clear sense of realistic spatial relationships of the various elements. So the figures standing out here in the front are followed by figures behind them that are farther away, and then figures even further back, and then in the far distance we have the front of a temple with additional figures carved there. So the sense that we have in this relief is of realistic space, from close to far. However, when we look at the relief on the Column of Trajan, we can see that there's no sense of depth here, really, other than overlapping. The figures are all the same size, no matter whether they're close to us or whether they're far away working on the city wall. They're all the same size, as opposed to our realistic representation over here, where the figures that are closest to us are, logically, larger, and the figures in the background here on the temple, those are very small, which would be typical of a realistic representation of space. However, here, all the figures are the same size no matter where they are in space, so it's an ambiguous or unrealistic representation of space. In addition, when you look at this representation here, you sense a large crowd that are standing behind the emperor and the sacrifice that he is performing. So you sense there's quite a crowd of people, but there's no way of knowing for sure how many people are there. You just get a sense that there's a large crowd. On the other hand, the sculptor of the relief here on the Column of Trajan wants you to know how many people there are in this gathering, in this crowd of soldiers. So not only are they all the same size, but here we have a crowd of men that should be distributed one behind the other, like this sculpture here, but instead what the artist wanted you to do is know exactly how many men there are there. So he shows them all, first of all, the same size, and then shows them as though they're standing on a tipped-up plane, a vertical plane. Either that or they're floating in air unrealistically. And of course he's doing that in order to show you how many men are there, but it suggests an unrealistic perspective, an unrealistic space. The third element is unrealistic scale. Now again, when we look at this sculpture here, we get a sense that everything is in proper scale. Large figures in the front, smaller ones behind, smaller ones even further behind. And then here we have a structure of a temple rising up above the entire group, and there's a sense that it's far away, that it's large, but that it's far away. On the other hand, over here on Trajan's column, we can see that the scale is unrealistic. In other words, the soldiers are just as tall as a city wall is. And of course, the reason that the sculptor is doing this is not that he doesn't understand scale. It's because he wants you to be able to clearly see and understand the story. That is, what are these guys doing? Well, they're building a city wall. And if he used realistic scale, you wouldn't see the city wall. It'd be too big, given the scale of the figures. And so instead, he makes the figures as large as the building is. Kind of reminds us a little bit of medieval art, where we get the same kind of ambiguity in terms of space, flattened reliefs, and unrealistic scale. So we can clearly see the soldiers here standing at the base of the wall. They are working on bringing things to the building site, passing up ashlar masonry, being passed from soldier to soldier and then put into place on the wall. If it had been all realistic scale, you wouldn't be able to see that. So just to summarize, the purpose for these abstractions. The flattened relief would reduce the shadows. Remember, this is out in the bright sunlight, and in order to be able to see clearly the images, the sculptor reduces the depth of the images so that the shadows don't create such dramatic, sharp, heavy shadows that would fall across the figures nearby and thereby obscure them. In terms of the ambiguous space, he wants to make the large groups evident here so that you can clearly understand who is there and what they are all doing. And then lastly, the unrealistic scale, purpose for that, abstracting reality, is to describe their activities clearly, as I described earlier, working on the wall. So the purposes for these abstractions, in which the sculptor is breaking with Roman tradition of realism to sacrifice that realism for narrative's sake, so that you can understand the story better. And so it represents a turning point in official Roman sculpture. From this time onward, more and more official Roman sculpture will turn toward abstractions as opposed to realism, which one could argue will lead ultimately to the abstractions of the Middle Ages. So now let's take a look at the basilica, a brief look at the basilica. Basilica Ulpia was its official name, and what a basilica was is a civic building. Now, I'd like to make a particular point of this because today, if you use the term basilica, you are referring to a religious building, such as St. Peter's Basilica in Rome. But for the Romans, a basilica was a civic building, not a religious one. And so what kind of things took place in a basilica? Well, various civic activities like law courts could be conducted here, business could be done within the halls of the basilica, or it could serve as a political venue where politicians could come and harangue the crowds and try to encourage them to vote for them to be elected to civic positions, political positions within the city. And so it became a civic structure. In the case of the Basilica Ulpia, it was a very large building, as were many of these basilicas. It's similar to the Basilica Nova or the Basilica Maxentius that we looked at earlier from the Republican era. So this particular one is 182 feet wide and 385 feet long. Now that, in terms of abstract measurements, that doesn't probably mean very much to us, but let me compare it to something that is more meaningful to you that you would have perhaps in your own experience. So here we see a floor plan of it that's 385 feet by 182. And then you see the openings here that would lead out onto the plaza. You see also these semicircular structures here on either end, these so-called apses on either end. And then behind the Basilica Ulpia, you see these buildings in the Column of Trajan, so they're represented here, libraries, Greek and Latin. So very large space here, and if we were to compare to something in our experience, Let's compare it to BYU football stadium. Most of you have probably seen the stadium, or at least you've seen a football field. They're all the same size, of course. And so if we compare our Basilica Ulpia main hall to the football stadium, you can see that it's about the same scale. So it gives you an idea of the vast interior spaces that basilicas often possessed. It's one of the reasons that the Christians later on will adopt this building type, because they too want vast interior spaces for their mass meetings. So here we see a cutaway model of it, showing these semicircular apse areas, the libraries on either side here, the openings out onto the forum, and then the interior was divided into 5 aisles by these rows of columns. So it's a vast interior space, and the whole thing is illuminated not by cross-barrel vaulting like we've talked about before, but it is illuminated with what's called a clerestory. Now, a clerestory is an upper row of windows that look into a building's interior space and provide light to them. You're probably most familiar with this in Catholic churches, where the main nave is illuminated primarily by a row of upper windows up near the ceiling. That's called a clerestory. So here we see a representation of the type of lighting effects that would have been typical of a space that possessed a clerestory. And then in addition, with this illustration, it nicely represents the beautiful decorative interiors of these buildings. Now, if you recall the Basilica Maxentius that we looked at earlier, the outside, my model of the outside showed a very plain exterior, but the insides of these buildings were beautifully appointed, just like imperial baths were. Now, in addition to the courtyard, the peristyle courts, the basilica, the monumental Column of Trajan, and then behind the temple to the deified Trajan, we also have associated with this whole structure what's called the markets of Trajan. Now, these semicircular structures here are not apses. These are referred to as apses when they're attached to a building like this. When they're separate like this, we call those exedra. And so right here on the east side of the Forum of Trajan is a very interesting complex called the Markets of Trajan. So here's an illustration of those markets. And basically, if you remember, we were on the side of the Escaline Hill here. So it's coming from an upper elevation here and then sloping down toward the valley floor. And so on the slope, Apollodorus has built for Trajan this shopping complex. And so we can see here a semicircular structure that kind of echoes the exedra, and then a street that goes along the upper portion, and then some shops and so on. So we want to take a look at that a little bit more closely. So here's the way that it looks. Of course, the exedra is gone, but now we still have the semicircular structure of the shops. And so we've got shops down here on the ground floor, then above them, additional shops that are windowed, and those shops communicate with this street out here that runs through the center of the complex at an upper level, and then beyond that, more shops. So here's our street, and this is the way it looks today. So we've got this flagstone street lined with shops, the structures built of opus latericium, and the doorways of the shops themselves made of travertine stone. So the shops opening out onto the street on both sides. Now, one of the unique features of this, as if that's not unique enough for the ancient world, is this area right here. This area is basically an indoor shopping mall. So again, it has been said that there's nothing in this world that hadn't been invented first by the Romans, and so indoor shopping malls is one of those things. So the street leads through that structure right there. So let's look at a 3D model of it. You can see that we've got the street coming through here and then shops opening out onto that street. Then the second level street and balcony. And then the whole thing covered over by cross-barrel vaulting. So basically providing indoor shopping for merchants in the markets of Trajan. A rather remarkable innovation for the time of ancient Rome. And then each of these shops not only has this large commodious doorway, but has an additional window above the doorway letting more light into the shops themselves. So here's the way that it actually looks today. So the doorways and the window, the upper openings, the upper street with a balcony along the edge of it, and then the whole thing covered over by cross-barrel vaulting using concrete. So the whole upper structural portion of this made from concrete with cross-barrel vaulting in order to allow plenty of, first of all, stability for the covering, but also plenty of light into the shopping area. Trajan selects Hadrian, another Spaniard, as his successor. So he too was born in Spain and was adopted as Trajan's son. Now you notice something a little bit different about him when compared to the other emperors that we've looked at so far, and that is the fact that he is wearing a beard. So Hadrian was a dedicated Hellenophile, meaning a lover of all things Greek. So he will establish the precedent of the imperial beard, which is a Greek affectation. And virtually every emperor after Hadrian will also sport that beard. Hadrian was not a fighter. He was a lover, so to speak. He did not have any military conquests or campaigns to his credit. Instead, he was an intellectual, a connoisseur of culture and fine living, a designer, a lover of the arts and of architecture, and even a somewhat notable architect himself. Even though he had no territorial conquests, he was arguably the most well-traveled of all Roman emperors, no matter what time span we're talking about. And that's because he wanted to become intimately familiar with the entire empire, all of the territories over which he ruled. So part of the intellectual curiosity that he possessed as an emperor. He was also one of the greatest of Rome's builders, as we will see with a couple of rather impressive projects that he took in hand. First one is the famous Hadrian's Wall. So as you can see here, a wall built of stone and concrete that snakes across the English countryside. So this was a wall that was built in order to prevent the barbarians from basically today's Scotland, northern Britain, from being able to penetrate into Roman Britain. And Britain was Roman for about 400 years approximately, first being added to the empire by the Emperor Claudius, if you remember all the way back to Claudius, the fourth emperor. And so north of the northern sections were unruly barbarians, and southern sections here is Roman Britain. And so in order to prevent the Picts, the northern barbarians, from constantly raiding down into Roman territory, Hadrian had his engineers build a wall from sea to sea across Britain in order to prevent them from being able to cross over. Now, of course, they could climb over the wall once it was built, assuming that they could get past the guards and the guard towers and so on, but they couldn't get their horses over, and they couldn't get their herds over. And so it was a very effective impediment to any attacks or migrations from the north into the south. So here's a map of the area that it spanned, 75 miles from one sea to the next, from coast to coast across northern Britain. And it served as a very effective barrier for tribes wanting to come from the north into the south. Here we see a reconstruction of the way the wall may have looked originally, with a watchtower. And then this illustration to remind us that the entire wall was lined with forts about every mile, forts or watchtowers that were garrisoned with Roman patrols and Roman military contingents in order to meet any kind of incursion from the north that might occur. However, Hadrian's greatest accomplishment and most celebrated architectural accomplishment is called the Pantheon, built in 118 to 125 AD. So again, here we are looking at the image of central Rome, basically. And again, you can identify the Circus Maximus here, the Colosseum, the Palatine Hill, the Capitoline Hill. And then right over here, we see the Pantheon, buried in amidst all these buildings in modern-day Rome. So let's fly down and take a look at the Pantheon right in that area. So here we see it as it stands today, submerged in all of these residential structures all around it, and a little bit of an open plaza out in front of it that contains a fountain. You can see the unique structure of it is that it is a domed tholos with a pedimented porch out in front. So the dome of this structure is rather unique, and we'll take a closer look at it here in just a moment. I wanted to show you this little model to get an idea of what the neighborhood would have looked like originally, with a forum out in front and the temple behind. And you can see that the topography is fairly flat. But as we look at the Pantheon today, we'll circle around here and come into it from the front. You can see that out in the front you've got this fountain, and then from the fountain to the base of the temple, it's actually a fairly significant slope downward. And that's because the area all around the temple has risen over the centuries through layers of debris, destruction and debris. The temple itself has been kept at its original location because it has been used as a Catholic church basically ever since ancient Roman times. And so the debris has been kept cleared away from the temple, while all around it the ground level rose up like you see here. So as you look at this image, you can see here's the base of the Pantheon, and then there's the level of the road today with these people standing up here. So it's about 20 feet of debris that is built up around the temple. But the temple itself sits down at the original level. So a couple of characteristics of this. Here you see that fountain. It was built by Bernini in the Baroque era. And even though you can't tell in this photograph, this is up higher than the temple is. Then you go down a slope to where the base of those columns are. The Pantheon turned out to be one of the most influential buildings in architectural history, rather like the octagonal room of the Domus Aurea. The dome and porch has been much copied over the centuries by various buildings. So the thing that seems to be most impressive is the tholos structure, the circular structure covered over by a dome with a large opening in the top called the oculus, or the eye, provides light into the interior. As you can see from the photograph here, there are no windows on the exterior. That's about the only source of light, in addition to the door in front. And then you've got this pedimented roof, kind of like a temple, classical Greek temple roof or Roman temple roof out here in the front. So here you see a building that's consciously based upon the design of the Pantheon. This, of course, is the Jefferson Memorial in Washington, D.C., built as late as 1945. And so the Pantheon still exerts some influence upon architectural designs even today. The thing architecturally, historically, about the building that's impressive is that it demonstrates the full potential of building with concrete. So both as a building material that we've talked about before, and also as a means of shaping space, like the octagonal hall of Nero's Domus Aurea. It was a new way of shaping space. In the case of that particular building, it was going from an octagonal structure built of brick to a circular structure in the dome built of concrete. The Pantheon here has obviously learned a good deal. The architects of the Pantheon have learned a good deal from studying the octagonal hall of the Domus Aurea. In fact, this pedimented porch, a very classical element, is about the only thing in the temple itself that is not rather revolutionary architecturally. Now you notice the title here. You notice the name Agrippa, M. Agrippa. If this was built at the command of Hadrian, and some scholars believe that he even had a hand in the architectural design of the building, he was an accomplished architect in his own right, then why isn't his name up here instead of Agrippa's name? Well, M. Agrippa refers to Marcus Agrippa, and if you remember all the way back to the early imperial period when Augustus won his battles against Mark Antony, his general was Marcus Agrippa, so a close associate of Augustus. So the very first Pantheon was built by Marcus Agrippa. And that's basically what it says up here, is Marcus Agrippa built this. And so in reality, he built the first one. There were several iterations between that one and this one, those having burned down. But Hadrian decides to rebuild it on a larger and grander scale as a temple to all the gods, a pantheon. So as we look at this model that has been cut away, we can see the interior, the way it's all organized. And it's interesting to note that the dome is 142 feet high from the floor to the summit, but also it's 142 feet around in circumference. So a perfect sphere could fit inside of this. And it represents the vault of heaven and a combination of that with the orb of the earth. So a combination of heaven and earth in this building symbolically. Here's a photograph of the interior, and it's rather difficult to get a complete shot of the interior because the space is so vast that it's very difficult to stand inside the building and get a complete view of it without using a fisheye lens or something of that nature, but that so distorts perspective that it's just nicer to look at a photograph like this. But you can get a sense of the scale of this by the people standing down on the floor below. It's a vast interior space without any question, so it's a marvel of engineering. And that marvel of engineering comes from the fact that it's still standing, quite frankly. Remember, it's built of concrete, so the lower sections here are very thick, 20-foot thick walls of concrete. And then as they rise up to this drum, and then from the drum, the dome rises to the opening, the oculus. And this whole dome is built of cast concrete. It features coffers on the inside for decorative purposes and practical purposes that I'll talk about in just a minute. But keep in mind, if you recall our study of arches, that a barrel vault or an arch puts stresses on the supports. It's trying to push the supports apart that it rests on. Dome does the same thing because a dome is basically simply an arch that has been turned in 360 degrees. And so it exerts the same stresses on the walls that an arch did. And so the dome here is trying to push the walls apart, but because of the very ingenious design of all the elements of it, in terms of the physics, the architect has been able to stabilize and neutralize that thrust in such a way that the dome has stood up for 2,000 years. It's still a marvel of engineering in modern engineers' eyes today. It truly is an architecture of space, so if you ever get to Rome, be sure and take a visit to the Pantheon. Hopefully you'll be there on a day when the choir is practicing because the acoustics in here are just marvelous. And it's worth noting that the structure is a Catholic church, And so it functions as a church today, even though the vast crowd of tourists tend to interfere with services, certainly. But nevertheless, it is a functioning church today. And that's the reason that it is still in such good condition. It's because it's been maintained as a church over all these centuries, 2 millennia for the most part. One side note of interest here is that those of you that are familiar with the Renaissance era may be familiar with the name Raphael, the great artist Raphael. He's buried inside this church in one of the niches. So a prime example of architecture of space. I can remember the very first time that I ever visited this. I knew nothing about it. I was just wandering around Rome at loose ends and saw this very interesting pedimented porch, and I thought, well, I wonder what's inside there. So I wandered down the hill and in through the doorways, and quite frankly, I can still remember my experience of walking through those doors and seeing this vast space just open up above me. It literally took my breath away, because I had no expectation of this vast space that was beyond those doors that I walked through. And I can still remember how impressive that was to see this huge space soaring up above my head with no interior supports. So the 40-foot wide oculus at the top provides light, of course. It's the main light source for the interior. And it's kind of interesting to watch during the course of a day, the light coming through, the sun being depicted on the walls of the Pantheon and moving over those walls as the sun moves across the sky. But it's the primary source of light because there are no other windows in this structure, only the light coming in through the monumental door to the north end of it. So it lets the light in, and was a pagan church, and so it lets the smoke of sacrifices and so forth out. But obviously it also lets in a good deal of rain when there's a rainstorm in Rome, because it's not glazed, it doesn't have any glass over it, it's open to the sky. And so a good deal of rain will come in through that 40-foot wide hole. And if you want to get an idea of the scale of that, just after the lecture, go out and pace off 40 feet and you'll get an idea of how big that hole is. Seems like it would weaken the structure, but it actually strengthens it in terms of the physics of an arch. But in any case, back to the problem of the rain, the floor is actually concave, meaning that it curves downward, slopes downward slightly toward the center where there's drains, so the water can run off and be drained away that might fall into the interior. So this great oculus actually provides stability to the dome. According to engineers, it acts like a three-dimensional arch keystone. I don't know exactly how that works, but just take my word for it. So the whole thing, as I mentioned before, is based on the octagonal hall at the Domus Aurea. Now, I mentioned the coffers, that's these recessed panels. They represent symbolically the orbit of the planets that were known in those days. So we've got a representation of the heavens here, and each panel would have had a gilded bronze star in the center of it to further represent the heavens. Those have long since disappeared, of course. But in addition to the decorative aspects of these coffers, because it adds visual variety to the interior of the dome, it also, quite frankly, lightens the load of this dome that is being exerted on the walls and the pressures that are being exerted on those walls. So the walls themselves, down at the base, the walls are some 20 feet thick, and then as they rise upward toward the oculus, toward the summit, they get progressively thinner. So by the time they get up here, they're only 4 feet thick. And in addition, the foundations of the building are granite-based concrete, so the concrete has granite chunks in it to make it more solid and structurally viable. And then as the walls rise, the granite is replaced by successively lighter types of stone until when you get to the very top, and this is for fill, right, like we've talked about with concrete before, always has fill in the mortar. And as you get to the top, that fill is pumice, so a very lightweight stone to try to keep the whole thing structurally stable. Now, another thing I want to mention here, we leave Rome for a bit to visit Judea, the Near East. Because if you'll remember, during the time of Nero, the Jews revolted in the Jewish wars that was put down violently by Vespasian and his son Titus. When Titus completed his conquest or his subduing of the Jews, he destroyed Jerusalem, leaving only a little bit of wall still standing with several towers called the Herodian Towers, several towers standing there in order to remind people of what a great city this once was and how even this great city succumbed to Roman military power. And so here's an illustration of Jerusalem as it looked from that time in 76 AD approximately until 130 AD. So 60 years have passed for the most part, when Hadrian, in touring the territories, comes to Palestine and wishes to see the great city of Jerusalem and the ruins of it. So he travels from the seacoast to Jerusalem in order to take a look at it. So what we see here is the ruins of the Temple Mount, and then there are those Herodian towers and the segment of wall that still remains, and then a very interesting feature called the city quarry. This quarry is where much of the stone would have been excavated to build large portions of the city back in the 8th century BC. That quarry is still here and is significant because it is here that the crucifixion of Christ took place in 30 AD approximately. And so this is where Golgotha would be, and not too far from it, a stone's throw from it, would have been the tomb inside of which he was buried. So Hadrian visits these ruins in 130 AD, and then he vows to rebuild the city as a gift to the Jews. However, the Jews will once again revolt just 2 years later. It's called the Bar Kokhba revolt, and flared up because the Jews feared that Hadrian intended to build a pagan temple to Jupiter in this city, and they did not wish to see that. And so they revolted once again. Now the revolt was crushed in 135 AD, just 3 years later, and this is the period of time when the Jews were finally dispersed throughout the empire, what we call today the diaspora, in order to spread them outside of Jerusalem away from the city, and they were actually prohibited by law to ever come close enough to even lay eyes on the city again, because it was too much of a rallying point for their rebellious kind of attitudes. So he will not rebuild the city of Jerusalem, but what Hadrian will do is to rebuild the city, a portion of it, as a military colony for retired legionaries, and rename it Aelia Capitolina. So this is one of those cities that was built for the benefit of the veterans to settle them. And so Hadrian does so, names it Aelia Capitolina, and it will be known by that name for the next approximately 400 years. Jerusalem will not be remembered virtually at all until we get well into the Christian era, into the Middle Ages, quite frankly, nearly, before we get any remembrance of the city of Jerusalem again. It's always known as Aelia or Aelia Capitolina. So what we see here is the Temple Mount, which was left in ruins, and a couple of forums, and these main streets that we see, typical of a Roman city, and then the lower portion here being left for the military camp. So one of the things that is interesting here for subsequent Christian history is that quarry where the stone had been quarried for early Jerusalem and the crucifixion took place. This quarry was filled in and was turned into the main forum of the city, and a temple to Venus was built here. So here's my model of that layout, featuring two forums, one by the Temple Mount, and then the main forum with a temple to Venus and perhaps a basilica, on one end. And then we have the east-west road, the decumanus, and the north-south road, the cardo, from the main entrance here. And then a secondary cardo that led off toward the Temple Mount and then turned south down toward the decumanus. And then the military camp of the 10th Legion was established in this unbuilt area. So here's a view from Google Earth of Jerusalem today, and what you see here, of course, is the Temple Mount as it exists today. This is the whole area here of the Temple Mount. We see the Islamic shrine, the Dome of the Rock here, and then across the city we see these gray domes as the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, which was built by the first Christian emperor, Constantine the Great. The first version of it, at least, was built over that quarry in order to celebrate the tomb or commemorate the location of the tomb of Christ. And is still where Christians go to today to visit the tomb of the Holy Sepulchre, which is inside that church. So just an interesting point here relative to later Christian history that is associated with the developments at the time of Hadrian. So there we see the main gate, and then the main cardo coming from north to south. The secondary cardo you can still see defined by the streets in Jerusalem today, and then the decumanus cutting across there from west to east up to the Temple Mount. And then finally, Hadrian's tomb. So here's a model of the way the tomb would have looked, and what we see here, of course, is a tholos structure based on those tumuli of the Etruscans and obviously influenced by Augustus's tomb, royal tomb. And then here's the way that it looks today right next to the Tiber River. So this is called the Castel Sant'Angelo, and through the Middle Ages and into the Renaissance was used as a fortress, actually that the popes created in order to be able to retreat to this to safety within the walls of the tomb, which was reconfigured into a fortress in case they ever needed it to save themselves from irate citizens. So here you see the kind of like an aqueduct, a raised structure here that would lead from the Vatican over in this area in a covered passageway here into the fortress where they could take refuge when needed. The fourth of the 5 good emperors comes from the Antonine family. This was Antoninus Pius, 138 to 161 AD. He was adopted by Hadrian, and the only thing that I want to talk about relative to him is the artwork on this pedestal. So, as I referred to earlier with the Column of Trajan, official royal art began to diverge from classical convention, and this is a good example of that. So relief sculpture is no longer treated as a window onto the world. In other words, the frame of the sculpture is like a window opening through which you're looking out at a recreation of the physical world in a realistic sort of way. It's no longer a window onto the world, but instead begins to borrow some abstractions from the private sector, like we see here in this relief carving from the side of a sarcophagus. In particular, what we're looking at here is not only the incorrect proportions, but in particular these little floating patches of earth that figures are perched upon in this funeral that we see here. So we have incorrect proportions and these patches of earth that we see also in this pedestal from Antoninus Pius. So what we have here is a cavalcade of cavalry officers riding in probably parade formation around a parade ground. So we have a group of military officers circling around the parade ground while a group of their comrades stands in the middle holding standards of the military. So again, if we look at this traditional sculpture, you can see that proportions, of course, are incorrect. You've got fairly tiny little horses here compared to the riders, and you'll also have these floating patches of earth that the riders are standing upon, that the horses are standing upon. So this is similar to our column of Trajan, where we have soldiers in a group whose heads are raised up higher than the ones in the front, so that we can clearly see the entire action and know how many workers are in those groups. Here, with this cavalcade of officers riding around their comrades, if it was done in correct perspective, we really wouldn't see the riders on the far side of the field. We would only see these folks out here in the front, nor would we really see all of the standard bearers in the middle. So what the artist has done is tilt that ground plane up vertically so that we can see all the action and all the participants, and then so they're not just floating in the middle of a dimensionless space, he places them on these little floating patches of earth. So again, the significance of this pedestal for Antoninus Pius is the fact that we see official royal sculpture moving further and further away from realism and toward greater abstraction. Then our last emperor of the 5 good ones is Marcus Aurelius. Now, of course, he's the adoptive son of Antoninus Pius. Unfortunately for the Roman Empire, Marcus Aurelius abandons, for whatever reason, the idea of choosing the best possible candidate to succeed him. Instead, goes back to conferring the royal purple upon his own natural son, a fellow by the name of Commodus. Unfortunately, Commodus basically returns the royal office back to the insanity that had existed before the coming of the 5 good emperors. So he's the last of the adoptive emperors. He spent very little time in Rome during his reign. You can see he reigned for about 20 years, but he spent very little time in the city of Rome, another one of those military emperors, and spent most of his time in constant wars on the borders of the empire, in the north against the Germans and in the east against the Parthians. It's during his reign, I think it's interesting to note that it's during his reign that the so-called Antonine Plague carried away some 5 million inhabitants. Some scholars think that perhaps he himself died in this plague. It was probably something like the Black Plague that later struck Europe in the Middle Ages. In terms of personality, he was a good emperor as far as that goes, as far as possible, having spent most of his time on the borders. He was another one of those intellectuals, more pious emperor that was known as a Stoic, embracing the Stoic philosophy. So this is that relief that I've been showing you several times here. It's of Marcus Aurelius performing in his function as Pontifex Maximus. So he's the individual standing here in the middle with a shawl over his head. So he's performing a sacrifice, burning incense probably, in his role as Pontifex Maximus. It's interesting to note in this that despite what I've said about continuing abstractions, the art doesn't change dramatically all of a sudden. It's a very gradual transition. So we can see here that classical traditions are still maintained for quite some time yet. So when we compare again to the abstractions on the Column of Trajan, we're still well within the classical traditions here, and it will be some time before these traditions are for the most part abandoned. The last work of art that I want to take a look at here from the High Imperial period is this equestrian statue of Marcus Aurelius. A very beautiful, larger than life-size sculpture, and represents Marcus Aurelius astride his favorite war horse probably. And in that gesture that bespeaks him making an announcement to his troops, so the imperator kind of a gesture. Now this is bronze. Originally it would have been gilded. Of course the gilding is for the most part long since gone. And in fact, this is not the original. The original sculpture is in the museum that you see in the background there, placed there for safekeeping, with a copy of it out here on the pedestal in the plaza, and for safekeeping because of the air pollution that attacks these antique works of art. And so today this is found in the Piazza Campidoglio, which is on the Capitoline Hill, a piazza that was designed specifically by Michelangelo during the Renaissance. But here we see another view of it, giving us an idea of the scale of the sculpture. And the thing that's interesting about it, in addition to just the fact that it's a beautiful work of art, is the fact that equestrian statues like this was a favorite mode of expression for the ancient Roman emperors, because it represented them in their full sense of power, astride a horse and gesturing or speaking to their troops, leading their troops. So there probably were numerous equestrian statues at the time of the empire. However, for the most part, this is the only one that has survived. So the question would be, what happened to all the rest of them? And the answer to that is simple. They were all melted down by Christians for the value of the bronze. And of course, they didn't care about the artistic or historical value of them, because these were representations of pagan emperors and so were meaningless to the Christians. So the question obviously would be, why did this one survive? And the answer to that is also simple. The Christians mistakenly believed that this was a representation of Constantine the Great, the first Christian emperor. Now, why they assumed that, I don't know the background of that, but nevertheless, that's why this one was preserved by the Christians, because they believe it represented their great hero, Constantine the Great, that individual that we'll talk about later, that embraces Christianity and enables it to survive, to eventually become the only legal religion of the empire, and certainly the religion of the imperial family. So we'll take a look at that whole series of events when we talk about the late empire.